Hello, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to our Cosmos DB study hall here on Learn Live. Hey, Alex, how are you doing today? I actually cannot hear you, Alex. Alex is clearly feeling silent today, it seems, but hopefully we get him. Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You're awesome. The joy of live TV, I guess, Heini.
Yeah.
I've been feeling great so far, but now I'm with the weather because my microphone was on mute. How often did you hear that? We can't hear you. You're on mute, especially
yeah,
during the
it
last
happens
2 years.
quite relatively often.
I'm good.
But glad to have you with your sound on as well. So
yes,
that helps.
In all fairness, my computer was a bit choppy the entire day, and GitHub was down as well. So if I go down all of a sudden, please don't mind me. I'm gonna try to fix it.
Yeah, hopefully we just don't go down at the same time, and one of us will be staying here online. Yeah, exactly. All 100%. Right.
Good.
So I think we're ready to get to our
deck at least, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, brilliant. So welcome everyone, and you have already said so. Welcome and thank you for that. Here's us. All up and ready, apparently not really as ready as we should have, but nevertheless, please don't mind that. And now we'll actually get our stuff together, and we're gonna get going. And welcome to another fantastic episode in the series of Cosmos DB, the usage of Azure Cosmos DB SQL API SDK. My name is Alex. I'm a Microsoft Regional Director as well as Microsoft.Azure MVP. And as confusing as that may be, I do not work for Microsoft. And here, Heini, with us, my good friend and my fellow MVP as well. What about introducing yourself as well?
Yeah. So I myself work as a DevOps consultant for a Finnish company called Polar Squad. We really focus on the DevOps side of things. So we're involved in software projects, data platform projects, and really from the DevOps side of things. And so I've got the privilege of also working with Cosmos DB in my daily work. So it's really exciting to be part of this series.
That really is a privilege, if you ask me, at least in my book, and especially when you have to deal with a lot of data, because you have mentioned data and software and DevOps. I mean, Cosmos DB is golden, at least in my book.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so interesting to get down to like, when does it really pay off and when is it really a good fit? And that is kind of what this series is about, not only learning how to use it, but also when it is a really excellent fit for the scenarios. So.
Oh yeah, totally, very much so. Now, the reality is that our audience has to know that there's a much bigger team, actually. It's not only the two of us here, quasi-prepared, because you're definitely more prepared than I am, apparently. Again, apologies for that. But there's so much more people who actually make this up work. And we have our fun moderator and good friend, fellow MVP, data platform MVP, Hasan, with us, who is ready to answer your questions. And actually, on that bombshell, I do want to tell all of our audience, whether you're on Twitch or Twitter or YouTube or Learn Live TV, you name it, get your questions ready. We want to make this interactive, especially today on the programming stuff. We're gonna get our hands dirty with some coding skills and whatnot, and want to hear and see your questions. Hasan will answer some. He will actually also push some to us. And since we have mentioned Hasan, I think it's also a good opportunity to mention all the program managers and product managers and principal program managers and all the good people at Microsoft who have put such a great effort actually to make this series happen, and also to have us talk about our passion for Cosmos DB and our experience.
Exactly.
Sweet. Well, today we're going to focus on a Microsoft Learn module, specifically on Azure Cosmos DB and the usage of a SDK, specifically the SQL API SDK. And we're going to do a lot of cool stuff around .NET and C# today. Obviously, there's much more SDKs for other platforms, for other programming languages, or other APIs as well. This is just one of them that we're going to focus on. So the learning objectives for today are actually going to be quite a few. First and foremost, we're going to integrate the Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos SDK library from NuGet. And we'll also connect to an Azure Cosmos DB account using a SQL API, using our SDK and .NET. I'm super excited.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, me too. It's really today about like how do we actually get to work with this on the development side as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
Time to
Now,
jump in.
NuGet hopefully is not a new thing to anyone here, but in case it is, don't feel frightened. NuGet is just this fantastic place where you have a bunch of different libraries and SDKs that you can leverage in your own code. I don't know about you, Heini, but in my opinion, software development these days is almost like building blocks. In all fairness, I'm a major fan of Legos, right? So just putting the Legos together and you're building something cool.
Yeah. And that's what we'll get to see today as well. It's kind of like choosing your Legos and then going from there as well. And it's all of it is quite ready for us as well. I'm
really excited
to start from
as
scratch.
Well. And again, you don't have to be a C# developer for this to be applicable to you. Even though you're going to see some code snippets and you're going to see some demos and you're going to see some examples, some fun ones, there are SDKs available to connect to an Azure Cosmos DB and manage an Azure Cosmos DB. Even do you can work with the data plane set of APIs and whatnot, which have a bunch of SDKs and wrappers on top, where you can work with the control plane, where you're like leveraging a new provisioning process of a Cosmos DB account, or alternatively managing the Cosmos DB account itself by using the Azure APIs. You name it. There's a bunch of APIs available in this big library called library, in the sense of you go and you pick your SDK from there, called NuGet. So there are a lot of different languages and frameworks supported, right, Heini?
Yeah. So we have, of course, .NET, which we're going to be focusing on today. We have Java, Python, JavaScript, and those are kind of the main languages that are available. And even though we're not today looking at the other languages specifically, you will kind of find the same logic oftentimes in the other languages as well. So really try to follow the logic of what pieces we need and how we plug them in and how we then start to work with the database itself. Even first learning just one language will help you also then grasp the other languages as well.
Absolutely. Good. So that being said, and this is just a heads up for you, because apparently my audio is a bit choppy, so I'll have to figure that one out. You have the slides right now, just to give you a heads up. you're in control. And I'm gonna fix my choppy audio, and I'll be momentarily back with you. But please keep our audience entertained.
Yes, I will definitely do my best. And while Alex is getting his setup rebooted, and hopefully he will come back a little more smooth, that will make it a little easier for me as well to understand. So let's just get started and jump straight to it. We first want to get started with understanding the SDK itself. And we are talking about the .NET SDK specifically. And so we're talking about the Microsoft Azure Cosmos library. And it is the latest version that we have available for the .NET SDK to work with Azure Cosmos DB SQL API. There has been different versions previously, but this is the most recent one. And the nice thing about this is that this library is open source and you can find it on GitHub. And that means, since it is open source, it is also open for the entire community to contribute. So if you are really feeling like you want to get involved, you can take the steps to start contributing to this library as well. So within this library, there are some classes that are really relevant for us when we work with Cosmos DB. And the first one of these is the Microsoft Azure Cosmos client. And this one is the client-side representation of your Azure Cosmos DB account. So pretty much by using this class, your application then has a representation of the entire Azure Cosmos DB account that you have created. And this is kind of the primary class that you start with when you're working with this SDK. And it's also, of course, based on the fact of the Cosmos DB structure. We have the Cosmos DB account first, within that account, we have the different databases, and then within the databases, you have the containers. And you might see that these classes that we have available kind of fit and align very nicely with those different hierarchies that we have available in Cosmos DB itself. So then the second class is the Microsoft Azure Cosmos database. And this is then what will on the client side be representing the database itself. And this is what includes all those common management things that you might want to do to your database. So just getting information about that specific database. You could even create a new database using this class, and we'll look at more concrete samples a bit later on today. And then the third class here is the Microsoft Azure Cosmos container. And this, on the other hand, is that logical representation of the container on the client side. And it has all the management operations that we might need for handling containers themselves. So again, we're kind of reflecting the hierarchy and structure of Cosmos DB account with having first the account, then the database, and then the containers. And for myself, I came originally from the infrastructure side. And for me, it was a little tricky to first grasp, like, well, how do I do this coding portion to really communicate with Cosmos DB? And it's like we need that representation of these resources that we have in Azure on our code side. And this is really what these three classes are for, to represent the account, to represent the database, and to represent the container. Perfect. Then, of course, to start working with this, we first need to be able to use this library. And so we start with importing it using a package manager. And when we are talking about .NET, the package manager that we use is NuGet. And we have Alex back. Welcome.
Yeah. Great to be back. Hopefully the sound is good now.
Yeah. Now, at least for now, you're sounding very, very clear.
Sweet. Yeah. It's a different room. It's a different audience. It's the same audience, but a different environment nonetheless. So
yeah.
Sorry about that. I mean, GitHub was down as well today, right? I think I can at least acknowledge that. Obviously, this is a very poor explanation. But yeah.
We're just glad to have you back.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
And now I can take a breath.
You can finally take a breath, indeed. Let me actually catch up real quick with you here. You're going to hear a lot of mouse clicks around. But I'm just getting back at the import from package manager. So you've already covered this one, which is awesome. What about actually importing a NuGet package? So when you're actually working with the NuGet packages themselves in your .NET applications directly, you can either use the .NET CLI, not the Azure CLI, the .NET CLI, or alternatively, what you could also do is just use your favorite IDE, say Visual Studio. And if you do that, then you have your NuGet package manager library for either a solution or the project, and you just import the NuGet package. When we say NuGet package, if this is a new concept to you, what we're referring to is effectively the proper term for library in software development, which contains all the classes and all the functionality that you'd be utilizing, leveraging within your application. So again, going to the example of a building block, this is your Lego brick that knows stuff and does stuff, right? And on that premise, with the Lego brick up and running, you effectively have the ability of not having to write a bunch of HTTP calls. And this might be mind-boggling now for some. All of these libraries that you're installing from NuGet, especially for the Azure services, are in reality just wrappers. Under the hood, for any service that you're ever calling on Azure, I mean, almost any service, there is an HTTP call generated, which happens obviously over HTTPS because it's going to be secure and nonetheless, but it's still an HTTP call. So one option would be you could write your own HTTP clients and it would take forever. Plus
yeah, exactly.
Or alternatively, you just install the NuGet library and then you just simplify the overall operation of connecting to the database and working with the data and purging the data or whatever else have you. Cool.
Yeah.
Now these packages, they can also be versioned, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this definitely helps you get started much faster than making your HTTP calls.
Oh, yeah. But if you want to go rogue, if you want to go wild, you can do that as well. I would never recommend that, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Try to estimate
And if
that
you
in the
have
sprint.
that inclination, then maybe channel it to actually contributing to the open source projects that are these libraries. So
Yeah, indeed.
yeah.
And in fact, all of the libraries recently were updated as well, which is also important. And they're constantly being updated. So if there was a functionality missing at some point in time, and then later on you decided, yeah, I actually needed that, there might be an update in the in the library that you're working with, and voila, that functionality might be added, which is important for people to remember, because it's always the same scenario where, Java has something and .NET doesn't, or the other way around. And surprise, surprise, you need to figure out how to actually achieve that functionality. Okay, cool. So how do you actually import the latest version of a package? Well, it's easier said than done. If you're still working with the .NET CLI, aka you're probably developing not from the terminal necessarily, but rather from VS Code, I would assume. Then one of the easiest ways is simply by invoking the .NET CLI and typing in .NET add package and then the name of the package that you're working with. And as Heini already has so kindly mentioned, when you're working with the Azure.Cosmos DB package, it's going to be Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos DB. Again, in the sense of NuGet, what this is just the unique identifier of the packages. And as you know, all packages are versioned, right? And any new feature would be a new package that would have a different version. So if you simply say that you're installing this one package in your project, and it's going to pull the latest version, which was marked as stable, because any NuGet package might as well be stable or a pre-release. And if it is a pre-release, then you would have to specify the explicit version that you want to install. Pre-release versions are actually something that I use a lot because I'm always super interested. I want to be on the edge, right? Bleeding edge. And I'm always super interested in what's coming up, what's new, and so on. But I never recommend them for production workloads.
Yeah, exactly. There can always be like some parts that are a little less stable on the preview feature. So you want to keep that in mind. And you can kind of have this process that you, for example, use the preview versions in your dev environment to develop those new features, but then you wouldn't take those into production until they become a stable version.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you simply use the version the command that you see here on the screen right now, you would pull the latest stable version. And if a newer package ever is available, it will actually rewrite or overwrite that package the moment you do an update. But non-stable pre-release versions, preview versions, name them whatever you want, are not going to be taken into account unless you actually explicitly specify what version you're installing.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. Awesome.
And then there's, of course, the option to actually import a specific version of the package, and you still are using the same command in the very beginning, same part in the beginning, and then you just specify the version. And then there you can, of course, specify an older version if that would be desired, that you just need some compatibility to be in place, for example. That might be a reason that you would aim for something a little older, or then you could go for one of those preview features as well.
Yeah, so along these lines, effectively, if you're interested in installing 3.22.1, as of right now, I might be wrong, but I think my latest installation of the Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos package was yesterday or the day before that. And as far as I remember, it was 3.24. It might be different now at this time, because people at Microsoft, they're hard at work at all times. But if you're interested in installing like an older version, a specific one, you could always use this. And I kind of sometimes use this approach where I'm very dependent on a very particular version. And I usually use that in my CI/CD pipelines, especially if this is a project that I know I'm not going to touch for the next 6 months or maybe a year. I would prefer to install a version that might be deprecated at some point in time rather than having my builds fail or my deployments fail all of a sudden because a class that I was dependent upon no longer exists or whatnot.
Yeah, that's very good point to remember, especially when automating things. Then we might want to have that dependency set very explicitly.
Yeah, I agree fully. Of course, there's an entire methodology and entire concept, and we'll probably spend the entire evening talking about update management and package management and whatnot. How do you handle that in a DevOps scenario or with a DevOps approach? How do you get notified when there's a new version? How do you get notified when there's a vulnerability figured out in an older version that you might depend upon? But that's a different conversation. Right now we're focusing on the Cosmos DB.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So once you import the package, then this specification will be added to your CS project file. And we will kind of take a sample look in a moment of what it looks like. And yeah, exactly here. So that is where you will see then the package reference, which will include the version. So no matter whether you specify the version when you are adding that package or not, that version will actually be set in this file. So it will tell which stable version, for example, it pulled.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always am a bit nostalgic when I remember back in the days when we were developing .NET Framework applications. There was the packages.config file that you'd have your packages in. That no longer exists if you're in .NET Core or .NET, simply .NET with .NET 6. Rather, everything happens within the CS project, if you are in a C# project, obviously. And your XML CS_proj file actually contains the references to the Cosmos DB or to any NuGet package rather that you would install, including obviously the Cosmos DB one. And as you can see here towards the lower part of this slide, let me bring up my virtual laser pointer. There's going to be a package reference, which is going to include the identifier of the package that you're working with. So that would be Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos in this case, as well as the actual version that you're installing. And this version would show up irrelevant of whether you're installing a explicit version yourself by typing in the version parameter on the .NET add package command, or alternatively, if you are just using the latest version, that is something that you would specify in the CLI, but the version would be explicitly spelled out in the package reference itself.
Yeah. And oftentimes when you're doing more complex projects in the cloud, you might have other Azure services in place as well that you might be using, like Azure Key Vault is often in the play when you are setting up any kind of application in Azure. So then you could, of course, have those added as well, and they would show up also in that package reference section in their own row there.
Yeah. So up until now, we probably spent, like 20 minutes talking about how you install the package.
Yeah.
It happens probably within a split of a second, obviously depending on your download speed as well.
Yeah, it doesn't take that long.
Yeah, definitely not. And now you can go to town almost with the package and start cranking it up, honestly, and just connecting to your Cosmos DB account. And this is the next cool topic that we'd have here. So you have your library imported, right? But your code is not yet ready to use it. What do you need to do with that?
So you, of course, once you have that imported, then you need to figure out which ones of the classes you, for example, need to use. And of course, you need to start with your using declaration in the beginning as well. You want to use this namespace. So that is where we always start.
Yeah, but if you're using a Smart Visual Studio IDE or Visual Studio Code, you can't just type in the class name and then you would let Visual Studio figure out which namespace you're missing, right? Because it is smart.
Exactly.
Boy, do I love Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code for that.
Yeah, it makes our life much easier.
It does. It definitely does. So once that is done, once you have your namespaces, your directives actually referenced within your class files, there are two common ways in which you can create an instantiation of your Cosmos client. Cosmos client is the name of the class that you'd be utilizing to effectively connect to your database and then just use it and leverage it by reading data from it and whatnot. So there are two constructors. There's an overload of that constructor. One of them takes a single value and the other one takes two values in. So the single value is going to be, obviously, it's a no-brainer, the connection string that you can copy from the Azure portal directly. And two values is going to be the connection string split, where one value is your key account and the other one is the password. I mean, this is so obvious. It's so that simple. I mean, rather than writing your HTTP client, I'd always just use this library. Why not?
Yeah. But it's pretty simple to connect in the beginning. And as said, you can always get the string and the endpoint from the Azure portal. We'll take a look where you can find them. And you can actually find the connection string that has both combined, or you can then just take the endpoint separately and the key itself separately. So you have two options.
So for this example right here, we're going to assume that there is some sort of a fictional endpoint for Azure Cosmos DB, which is called DP420, which, as you might expect, is actually going to be the name of the Cosmos DB account, which was provisioned in Azure. And its sample fictional key would be the one that you see here with small caps F, capital D, capital R, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read it out loud because that's completely out of the purpose here, unless you want to just spoil everyone's time. But the way you work with it is that you use, again, either the connection string or the endpoint and the key as two different variables. And then you provide them to the Cosmos client. I also want to emphasize another thing, which is a bit of syntactic sugar in C#, in the newer versions of C#. This might sound to some like old school people like myself who have been using C# for so long, like this is an error. Hey, you haven't specified here your constructor. But this is spot on, absolutely correct, because C# actually, the compiler in Frozen is smart enough to understand that since you have declared a variable of this type and you have not declared which constructor type you want to use, it is going to be the constructor from within that class, not an overloaded one from a class that inherits it, which is called polymorphism. Remember that?
Important terminology to remember.
Very important.
At all times.
Every HR individual I've ever met in an interview always asks us that question and hardly ever knows what it actually means.
Yeah. So maybe it's better to know what it means than the actual word.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Cool. So there's one option where you use the connection string, or alternatively, you could use the two variables and then pass them in as two different parameters for the constructor of the Cosmos client. And once you have that under the table, at this point,
then we are then, of course, able to then connect to the actual account. So then we use that client that we created to then, for example, read from the Cosmos DB account. But first we have to have the client, and then we can use the account properties or use it to fetch, for example, the account properties or whatever we might want to do with it.
And I think it's relevant for people to know that there's a handful of different classes available within the library that you're installing for NuGet. Cosmos client was one that you have used to instantiate the client and have it connected. Account properties is another one that you could leverage to retrieve the information and the properties in the configuration of your Cosmos account, hence the name account properties. And there's so much more, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it becomes tedious and you don't exactly know, how do I figure out what is the right class name? Do I need to go to Microsoft Docs and read a ton of million different tutorials to figure out them? But you could also go the other way around, where you just type in the namespace name where all of these clients are found. Again, that's Microsoft Azure.Cosmos. And then IntelliSense will be smart enough in VS and VS Code to actually tell you, hey, you have all of these classes available. Why not use them? And it's also going to tell you, thanks to the documentation-based XML files, here is what these classes do, right?
Yeah.
And the naming, strategy-wise, the convention for the naming is actually super cool, because it also makes it straightforward and comprehensive for people and developers to understand what the various responsibilities of these classes are.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
So with account properties, you get account properties.
Exactly. Yeah.
How obvious is that?
It's nice to have the namings very, very clear and tell what we're actually doing. And then, of course, once we have the client instance, that then opens up us possibilities to, for example, work with the databases. So we can either create or fetch an existing database or whatever we might need to do within that account specifically. And if we're, for example, trying to retrieve an existing database, then we would use this client get database command. And of course, we would be using the database class in there. So again, it's quite well explaining what purpose it is for. So easy to figure out which one to use.
And along the same lines, because you mentioned previously, if you want to create a database, there's going to be, I might speculate, a create database method, or maybe an async one. I don't know. What do you say?
It is possible. Let's see.
There you go. Woo-hoo. What about that?
Yeah, exactly.
So there is indeed a client create database async method that you could leverage. Again, here you would specify the name of the database that you want to create. And you would always probably prefer to use a asynchronous method for this one, so that your main thread, your UI thread, does not block on actually having the database created whilst the network call is done, and so on and so forth. But rather you have a delegate under the hood.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question for you, Heini. How do you go about scenarios where the database is already created? How do you figure out if it is created or not? Like, do you call get, and then if that throws an exception, do you call create, or?
Well, we have another option. We actually have this cool thing that create if exists, or I mean, if not exists. So
indeed, yeah.
Makes it quite simple and almost kind of makes you think that shouldn't you always be using this method of create database if not exists, if you're not quite sure if it's going to be there. So
yeah, spot on. Do you typically use this, or do you typically use the get database instead?
I typically use this one. Yeah.
Cool.
What about you?
Nice to know. I do have some mixed feelings about this one, because I ran at some point some tests, which you must be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not sure if they still stick up or not. This was back in the days of the DocumentDB specific NuGet packages. And we have realized that for some reason, there was some extra latency on the create database if not exists versus the get database. So on the assumption that we would connect to a database that would never be deleted, right? By going by that assumption, we decided to use the get database, obviously also assuming that we're going to use dependency injection and have the client inject it, which was something that back in those days you couldn't do, but we figured out the way for that. And thankfully, the nice people at Microsoft actually made it simple these days in the Cosmos client for that to be injected. But we're going to get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
Let's not spoil the surprise yet.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the hierarchy in any Cosmos account is that you have the account like at the root level, and under that you have your database, and under the database you have your containers. In some of the previous series of this fantastic live TV, in some of the previous episodes, we have actually talked about the hierarchy and how you could partition share the throughput at the database level with the multiple containers. And we've talked about scenarios where you might be doing that, but your data does not reside within the database directly. It resides within containers. So obviously there has to be a way for you to interact with the containers, similarly as you do with the account or with the database. And you probably see what we did here. We talked about installing the NuGet package, then using the the client for Cosmos to connect to it. Then we talked about the account because that's at the root level. Then we talked about the database. Now we're talking about the container client, which is named, as you might expect, container. I told you, everything is super, super simple, super straightforward, so comprehensive.
Yeah.
So here
and
we
you
see...
even
Go ahead.
And you even find the same methods in there. So we have the get container here, which is very similar to get database on the database level.
Yeah, absolutely. Homologous to that. So if you do not have a container, do you argue that there might be a create container?
Well, it is possible. It would kind of make sense if there was one. So yes.
So what do these parameters actually mean? Let's tell our nice audience, what do these parameters mean here? Cosmic Works, / category ID, and 400.
Yeah. So let's think back on what are the properties that we have to set at the time when we are creating a container. And the first thing, of course, what we need to give it is the name for that container. But in addition to the name, at the container level, this is where we always need to specify the partition key. And that is this category ID. Sorry, I had it on so small I couldn't see it anymore. We are specifying the category ID as the partition key here. But also, like the most common place to specify also the throughput or the RUs is at the container level. And that is what the 400 is there for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to remind our audience that despite these being properties in a constructor, some of these can be changed and some of them cannot. So for example, once you have chosen your partition key, you're kind of stuck with that. If you want a new partition key, the only way you can go about it is you create a new container, you change the partition key to whatever you want, and then you need to seed it with some data. And you could use, if you watch our previous episode on this series, you could use Data Factory to move data from one place to another, or you can write your own application if you want. And if you obviously have nothing else to do over the weekend. And
it could be the case.
Yeah, maybe. And then the 400 is the RUs that, in this case, would be provisioned throughput for the container. But obviously, there are alternatives actually to share the RUs with the database or configure auto-scale or alternatively configure serverless.
Exactly.
And similarly, as an homology again to the create database if not exists, there is a similar method that you would call create container if not exists async. Okay, enough about that. Let's now get to the good part.
Yes.
Singleton.
More exciting.
So the reality is that each time you instantiate a Cosmos client, under the hood, remember I told you this is a wrapper on HTTP clients and the APIs themselves. Had you not had thread-safe operations and singletons and so on and so forth, you'd end up creating a new HTTP client, which means that you could not leverage capabilities such as configuring connection polling and leveraging effectively the factory for an HTTP client and whatnot. And it would just add additional latency to the overall processing power of your application and the CPU consumption and whatnot. And it would just be slower, right? So you want to have a singleton, you want to use dependency injection, you want to make sure that you're using this object across the entire application. And the good news is that the way it is implemented by the nice people at Microsoft is that it's already thread safe for you, so you don't need to worry about that. It already efficiently manages connections, and it also caches the addresses when operating in what we refer to as direct mode. There are two modes, actually, to work with.
Yeah. We can either work in the gateway mode or direct mode. And I actually think we have a slide coming up about that in a moment. So
yeah, that's a good segue. That's a very good segue to
wait
that.
for that.
Yeah. So when you configure your Cosmos client, there is a Cosmos client options class that actually provides you with a range of different options that you could configure for the client when it connects to an account. And these include, but obviously would not be limited to the mode that you use to connect to the account, the consistency level. Remember the 5 consistency levels? We're going to talk about them in a bit. And also the preferred account regions. And that's pretty interesting. So when you're connecting to your Cosmos DB account using the Cosmos client, there are a few assumptions that the client makes. The first one is that you will want to connect to the first writable or the primary region of your account. The second one would be that you want to use the default consistency level for the account when you're reading requests. And the third one would be that you will connect directly to the data nodes for requests. But there are other assumptions which are not even listed here, and that's something that you should be mindful about. But these assumptions can also be reconfigured when you use the Cosmos client.
Yeah.
Want to tell us maybe a couple of words about that?
Yeah. So we have this capability of overriding these default options with this Cosmos client options class that we are able to use. And we're going to go a little more into detail of how you override these different settings, because it is a little bit dependent on what you are doing. And so, for example, for the connectivity mode, we have some options. For the consistency, for example, we are not able to go to a more strict consistency and so forth. So we have some options that we can set there. And so we can go a little more into detail to the different ones that we can set there.
Yeah. So for example, with the client options that we've previously mentioned, there's the direct and the gateway mode. And the direct, for example, will be the one that would only be used in the initialization and cache addresses actually for direct connectivity of the data modes. As for gateway, all the requests in this scenario would be routed through the Azure Cosmos DB gateway as a proxy instead. So the default setting, I think it's important to mention here, is the direct mode. And it's also the option that would be also much more performant as a matter of fact, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. And the way you configure that is on the assumption that you're instantiating a Cosmos client option class, you would specify the various properties that are part of this class. And once you have configured them, you just provide this client options effectively as a parameter for your Cosmos client, and that would be it. So when the Cosmos client would hook up a new connection to the actual account, it would take into assumption the options that you have configured programmatically.
Yeah. And so then the other option that we are able to change is the consistency level. And this is kind of one of the tricky parts of Cosmos DB to really understand, like, what does this even mean? and there are different levels of consistencies, and why we even talk about consistencies with Cosmos DB is because we have these options to configure the multi-region reads and writes. And that is what brings kind of this issue of how do we then determine if the person reading from another region, for example, that they have that most recent data, and what kind of even requirements do we have about that consistency of being able to fetch the most recent data from another region, for example.
I do appreciate the way they're actually presented here on the slide deck, because they're presented from the least consistent to the most consistent one. Strong being the most consistent one. And there's always a bit of confusion with people, especially when they're new to Cosmos DB, as to which one does what. But one way to think about it, in my opinion at least, is if you start from bottom up on this screen, strong is the one that like guarantees to return the most recent committed version of an item. And this means that a client that connects to strong would never see an uncommitted or some sort of a partial write. And any user would always be guaranteed to read the latest committed value. Because the problem always in distributed systems is that you have to pick your, there's always like this sweet spot of picking, do you want some data that you know for a fact has been replicated across and everyone is aware of that? Or alternatively, do you want whatever data which is super, super, super fresh and new, but others might not know about it yet? Because this can obviously create a lot of corruption. So depending on your system, you would pick one or the other. So strong is where everything is super strong, consistently strong. You have a guarantee of the most recent committed version of an item to be returned. Whereas the bounded staleness consistency is the one that would sometimes lag behind the writes by something that is referred to as at most k versions of an item, given by a t interval, whichever is reached first. So in other words, when you choose bounded staleness, the staleness can be configured either by lagging behind a number of versions, which is the k factor, or a time interval which might be accepted that reads might lag behind the writes. So if you have a single account region, the minimum value of your k and t would be 10 write operations or 5 seconds. But if you have multi-regions, because they span across different geographies, the K and the T's would be 100,000 writes as operations and 300 seconds rather than just 5. So you want to be super mindful about that. And then you have session consistency, which assumes that a single writer session is, or sharing the session token for multiple writers would ever take occurrence. Then you have eventual consistency, which is like at some point the information that you're reading is consistent. You can just think of it like that. Or consistent prefix, where you're effectively guaranteeing that for a number of values, you always have consistency within the reads. So there is a guarantee here that reads would never see out of order writes, but they might not be up to date because they're not strong, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully this gives people some insight, even though they might be even more confused as they previously were.
Yeah. Hopefully it clarifies it a bit.
Feel free, people, to read up on Microsoft Docs, because this is something very important. The consistency levels are like super important because they both impact the performance and the RU consumption and a bunch more. So that's something that you would not choose lightly.
Exactly. And you can actually, like, if you create a Cosmos DB account and you go to the consistency tab, they have little notes kind of represent how the consistency works. So that might help seeing that visual kind of make sense of what does this actually mean, because it can be a little difficult to understand with just words of how it actually functions. The one thing with setting the options of the consistency level and to note there is that we can only use this to weaken the consistency level for reads. So we cannot either strengthen it or we cannot also apply it to writes. So to weaken the reads. So for example, if we had strong consistency set at our entire Azure Cosmos DB account level, then we could, for example, specify that, hey, we actually want to use eventual consistency for these reads. So that's kind of what this sample could be representing here.
Heini, I'm always like super hands-on, and what I just did here is that I brought up the consistency level article, which is available on Microsoft Docs, and hopefully this will give people a bit more insight. But I did want to raise some awareness towards these animations here, which might not tell a lot of people. But here's how I think about it when you're picking your consistency prior to actually configuring that, as Heini showed with your Cosmos client options. Think of these music notes as symphony. If you have strong consistency, it sounds good everywhere, the way it is played. If you have bounded staleness consistency, it's still going to sound good up to a point because it will be laggy, right? But then as you choose the other consistency levels, this one, for example, is session. The people in Australia East here are going to hear something that's going to probably sound very, very bad because it only has every other note. It's going to be choppy as my sound was at the beginning of this session, right?
Exactly.
There you go. Here is not your eventual consistency, but rather your consistent prefix, where you only have a number of nodes actually being passed through to all of these regions, but at least they are in order, which is important because if they would come all mixed up, then not only would your sound be choppy, but it would be like ancient alien language. And you sometimes hear that even over the phone. And here's your eventual consistency, which means that, at some point we're going to get some data. And this is all messed up. Like this is all choppy, all just scrambled. Hopefully this makes more sense now.
Yeah, perfect. That was good to pull that up. And yeah, the same animations are available also in the portal at your Cosmos DB. So you can find them in many places. But I really like this symphony metaphor here. It makes actually quite a lot of sense.
So when it comes to actually preferring your setting your preferred regions, just as always, you just use that Cosmos client option, which is super straightforward. And by default, the client would always use the first writable region for the request. And this is typically referred to as the primary region, even though the concept of a primary region otherwise is a bit toxic in the Cosmos DB sense, especially when you use multi-masters. But that's a different conversation. And you can use either the Cosmos Client Options application region property or the application preferred region property for this matter to override the behavior. The application region property that you'd be utilizing would set the single preferred region that the client will connect to for operations. And if that region is unavailable, the client will by default fall back to the priority list set on the account to determine the next region. And if this, for example, would be West Europe, as you see it right here, then you would simply set it with the application region equals West Europe as a string, West US as a string, and there you have it. Quite straightforward. Now, one thing that I always find a bit difficult, especially if you're not big on Azure Bicep or Azure Resource Manager, is remembering the name of the various regions at Azure, especially because they have to be spelled with their like shorthand notation, West US with no spaces, small caps and stuff like that. So that might be a bit tedious to some, especially because the number of regions is constantly growing. We're at, I simply say 70 plus because I don't even remember how many regions we have every other month. Though it feels like Microsoft is announcing a new region, so it's already too much.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. Shall we get our hands dirty maybe in a quick demo?
Yeah, let's do that. So, all right. We are going to go through the exercise that you are also able to find in the Learn module itself. And when you go here yourself, you can either launch it in a lab, so it will create a virtual machine and everything you need to run this. Or the other thing is that you can actually set this up on your own machine and follow the exercise instructions. There's the link, and you can just set it up for yourself. And to make it a little more smooth, I have taken some preliminary steps so that we don't have to wait for a Cosmos DB account to be created, etc. So I have, before we came online, I have created a Cosmos DB account for us. I have created in West Europe, since I am kind of located close by, but I could have, of course, chosen any region that I want. And I just kind of set the minimum bare settings that are necessary to just set everything up. So that's kind of the first step that you're going to be doing when you start this exercise.
Now, I do want to add and remind people that if you are following this after this live, using Microsoft Learn, the only thing you need is a Microsoft account, which is completely for free. You don't need to have an Azure subscription. You don't need to provision a Cosmos DB account for yourself. You don't need to provide any credit card. You just click that one button that Heini showed you previously, which is Launch Lab. You wait somewhere in between 1.5 minutes towards 2 minutes, and the brand new virtual machine with all the tools necessary will pop up in a fantastic browser window. Hopefully you're using Edge for that, but you don't have to. And you will have even access to an Azure subscription using some generic user account and a generic password. So you can get your hands dirty with Cosmos DB literally for nothing, nada. It's gratis, it's free. Whatever noun you want to, whatever adjective you want to use.
Yeah, exactly. That is really nice about this lab option here. And it takes only a few minutes to set up, so it doesn't also take that much time. So what we're going to do here is we have a Git repository that you are going to clone to your computer. If you have the lab set up, those are all provided for you, and all the instructions and steps and so forth. I took the liberty to do this beforehand. As mentioned, things have been down today, so also I'm glad I did pull it beforehand, just in case there was any glitches at this point either, so we don't have to have any surprises at this point.
I just realized I should have probably sacrificed the production virtual machine in favor of the demo gods prior to coming live. So
probably. Exactly. And if you're pulling the entire Git repo, there will be like several of the exercises in the same repo. So I have just navigated to just one of the folders that we are working with today. And so we're just going to get started with what we were going through earlier today. So what we are going to first do, of course, to get started so that we can use the Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos package, we needed to do what?
Drum roll. Install .NET install, a .NET add package, and then specify the package name. Yoo-hoo!
So I'm just going to use the .NET CLI, and you will see that it doesn't take a lot of time at all. It's all ready. And what we see now that has appeared by doing that, we see this app.csproj file here with actually some data in it. So there was some base data in here about the project and the target framework, but this portion here has been now added automatically for us. And there is the version specified as well. And this time we did specify a specific version that we want to use. So that one. All right. And so after we've done that, then that means that we are ready to start coding away and, you know, getting set up in whatever way we want. And for this exercise, we're going to need some using directives in the beginning. So we're going to use the system and the system link as well, of course, then the Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos one. And then we had two options about connecting to our Cosmos client. And the first one was to have the connection string, and the other one was to have the endpoint and the key separate. So for this exercise, we are doing the two separate ones. So I'm just going to put in the variable there. And what we will need to pull out then is from the portal, we will need to fetch our endpoint. So I need to go into the portal and check what is our endpoint. And you will find that this URL here, and you can just copy paste that and go back to back to our window here and put that in there. All right. And then the other one that we're going to need is the key. So let's just grab that one as well.
Now, in all fairness, what people are seeing here in Visual Studio Code is just a good explanation and demo purpose, right? Because in a typical scenario, you'd have like a proper class, not a script C# file, and in the proper class, you'd have namespaces and stuff like that, right? And you'd probably use some sort of dependency injection system. But what we're doing here is that we're just proving the ease of utilizing these SQL API SDKs, and just how easy it is to leverage them, honestly.
Yeah. And if you're going to be joining the study hall for the next upcoming sessions as well, also the scenarios are going to get a little more complex as we go along. So it's definitely worth just taking it easy in the beginning, getting started, and then moving on to more complex scenarios. And then to find the keys, we are going to go to this keys tab from our Cosmos DB account. You can find it down a bit, and you can find either read-write keys or read-only keys. And of course, if you're only going to read some data, you should be pulling one of the read-only keys.
I must say, I do appreciate that everything is nicely blurred. It feels like this is post-production, but no, it's live. There's no post-production. This is just a fun, cool extension, I guess you're using, right?
There's an Azure Mask extension that blurs all the keys and subscription IDs and things like that. So it's pretty fun. But you're actually going to see my key in a moment. And also, if you are choosing to actually connect with a connection string, you would come down here to either the primary or the secondary connection string. And it's just formatted for you in a ready-made way so that you don't kind of have to worry about the correct format. Yeah, here's my key.
No longer a secret.
No longer a secret. And now you can tell I haven't been coding in C# for a bit because I'm dropping my ends of the lines.
No worries. We're still good.
All right. Then, what was the first thing we need?
So we have the endpoint, we have the Cosmos DB. We want to leverage the library, so we probably need some sort of a reference towards the library. And I would guess we need a client for that. We're probably going to instantiate some sort of a class object, right? Cosmos client was the one that we've talked about previously. But by the way, Heini, do me a favor. Type in Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos. So capital M, capital A. Yeah, there we go. So we're spelling out the namespace here. .Azure.Cosmos. And then hit a full stop, the full stop key.
What is a full stop key?
Period. And here are all the classes I previously referred to. Like there are enumerators and classes and a bunch more. And in case you're ever wondering which one should I be using, there's one option, right? And obviously there's better ways. You could use even GitHub Copilot, and it would tell you what exactly is the next thing you need to type out. And just be dumb about it if you want. But still, this is a way to actually figure out what other classes do you have here available. In case you're one of those people like myself who fancy reading Microsoft Docs as much as you can, but at some point you want to like do reverse engineering and you want to get your hands dirty, all messy and oily with these classes and figure out what they're used for and whatnot. Exactly. So there's one way. But let's make this code look pretty. So let's just simply say Cosmos client and no namespace in front, and that would be just simpler.
Yes, let's do that. And even when I start, if I kind of know the beginning of the class, it helps me out quite a bit. So let's just call that a client. And then we're creating a new one. And it wants to be intelligent. I don't want it to be intelligent.
Yeah, we can just the name of the object there because this is .NET 6. It's part of the beauty with .NET 6.
Exactly.
But you can already tell that even IntelliSense is smart enough, and it recognizes that even though you've only typed in the new keyword, you're referring to a Cosmos client constructor because you saw the suggestions and the overload of the constructor with the various options with a single parameter or dual parameter. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. Sometimes a little too smart.
Let's keep that as a secret.
Exactly. So for this purpose, we're going to be just looking at the account properties at this point. And so again, it's luckily helping me out a bit with what I want to possibly use. And then I'm just going to put in await. And I want to use that client that I just created. And then I want to do read account async. And then, of course, my parentheses and this one in place. It's funny, I don't know, like that full stop was so weird to me. Like I was going to put in the period and then I got so confused. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, what's a half stop?
I have no idea. All right. But now we're connecting to we have the client and then we are connecting to the account. But just having that, we aren't really, yet getting anything out. We are just reading the account. But we might actually want to like print something. So for example, we can have the console and then just write line and then put in whatever string we might want in there. So for example, we can put in just account. And then we want to reference that account ID.
I must say I appreciate you for using a tab indentation rather than a space there.
Yeah.
Even though this might open up the war of tabs versus spaces, I don't want to do that, but really neat. Nice touch.
I have to confess it was used in the exercises as well, but I myself kind of prefer it as well. So
there you go.
Yeah. And always copy-paste coding, there's nothing like that. So for example, then if we want to get, for example, if I could write the primary, we want to get the read region or the write region. Let's grab the read region.
Whatever region, read region. Okay, cool.
And then it should give me some.
So one option is if you hit the backspace a couple of times, or if you just hold down the control key and then hit the space bar.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
There's readable regions. That's part of the magic of Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code and all of those useful tools. So hold down the control key when in doubt, then hit the space bar once, and intelligence is going to be invoked back.
Yeah. So here we can, for example, let's grab the first or default. And then.
So that's why you added LinkU for that. I was wondering why are we going to use LinkU, but now it makes sense. First or default.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can use that one, and then from there we can grab the name of that region. So
brilliant.
There's two things we're going to write out. Nothing fancy. And then we are pretty much after that, we are just ready to run this massive complex application and just see what it prints out. And we will see then it connecting live to our Cosmos DB account. And then what we, of course, want to do here. You see my terminal just fine. I think it'll be fine in a moment. So we just run that. I'm in the correct folder, so it's going to grab that. And in a moment, it should print out.
Yeah, it's right there on top. There was a tooltip on top. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sweet.
There we go. And you can kind of, there's only a few things that are done in the exercise itself, but when you're doing the exercise, go wild with it, test out different things. We learned how to create databases and containers, etc. So try it all out. Don't feel restricted to only the things that are listed in the exercises themselves.
I must confess, at some point, what I did actually was open up Fiddler and inspect all of the HTTPS traffic that these libraries do, because I tried to figure out how they implemented the functionality that we actually then ended up writing in a REST API. Remember when I
Yeah.
told you that who's the crazy guy over a weekend writing an HTTP wrapper rather than actually using a library? Now you know.
Yeah, I think you might have been talking about yourself.
I might have. One can only speculate.
Yeah, exactly. Like none of us have ever done anything similar like that. No.
No.
No. Yeah.
Sure.
But that's kind of all the easy ways in which you get started. Of course, in real life, you wouldn't want to have your key in your code, and there's many little details in there that you want to kind of clean up. But those things we are getting more into detail in the following modules. So
and
do
again,
stick around.
It's really about just getting started here at this point, because in the exercise that Heini wrote earlier, she was using a console application with a script-like approach in .NET 6, no fancy classes, no program CS, no nothing like that, no namespaces.
Exactly.
And this just helps you figure out how the library works. At some point, you might already have it injected and working within your project. Maybe it's an ASP.NET project, maybe super complex, right? And there's one thing that doesn't work. You can always just spin up an instance of VS Code, or just use the terminal.NET, new console.NET add package, Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos, and within a few minutes or so, you are up and running and testing that functionality yourself, which I appreciate a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
That was really cool, Heini. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Are we ready to test people's knowledge?
I think we are. Yeah,
Sweet.
I'm ready.
Let's do that. And I do want to emphasize to our audience, everyone can jump in and answer to these. So if you actually head over to HTTPS, which obviously you don't have to type in, aka.ms/polls, you'll actually see these questions as they show up. And whilst we are trying to figure out the right answer for the first question, Heini, do you mind reading this one out loud? I'm actually going to try to get to the answer and see what our audience is answering, and figure out if they were paying attention or not.
Excellent. So our first question is that which class should you use to interact with containers in the Azure Cosmos DB SDK for .NET? And our options are A, the document collection, B, container, C, Cosmos container.
It's a good one. So which class do you use to interact with containers? I wonder, is it Cosmos container or document container? Those words are definitely not randomly chosen, right? Because document container is a synonym or an old name for Cosmos DB. But exactly. I think I might be wrong, but I think that we haven't seen either of these, and rather we have seen a class called container. I don't know if I'm correct or not. Let's see.
Yoo-hoo! Oh yeah, nice work.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
Good. And
excellent.
We do actually have a good audience and a good number of people answering this one. So that's nice. Thank you for paying attention, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's take the second one. Which Cosmos client constructor should you use when you have two string variables for the account endpoint and key, along with the Cosmos client option object? We haven't seen this example in our slides or during the previous exercise that we went through. We only saw a Cosmos client constructor with one parameter, which was the connection string, another option, another overload, which had two parameters, which had a string for the endpoint, a string for the key, but now they're asking for another type of a constructor. One might speculate that it should have three parameters, right? So which one is it? Drum roll.
I would be kind of thinking that it might be the third one, C with the 3.
I'm with you with that one, Heini. I think it's the third one. Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's see. It is C. No pun intended. Good one.
Perfect.
Want to take the last question?
Yeah. Let's go for it. So our third question is that what is the name of the Azure Cosmos DB SDK for .NET on NuGet? So what name do you have to search for to find it? So is it Microsoft Azure Cosmos, Microsoft Azure Documents, or Microsoft Azure Document DB?
I like some of these questions actually try to confuse you, right?
Yeah.
Document DB was the old name of Cosmos DB.
Exactly.
And then documents might be a reference to the fact that you have multiple types of SQL of NoSQL. One of them document NoSQL, table key NoSQL, graph NoSQL, columnar. But in this case, given the question, name of the Azure Cosmos DB SDK for .NET on NuGet, and given the .NET add package command that we wrote previously, I would go for A. What about you?
Yeah, I would go for A because I don't really, like we've mentioned document DB as the old name, but we haven't really talked about documents or document DB today. So definitely A.
Okay, let's see. Yoo-hoo, we were right again.
Yeah, would be a bummer to get one wrong at this point.
It would be.
Oops.
Whoops. Yeah.
And we got a lot of right answers for this one, so very well done.
Very well done to our audience.
Excellent.
Congratulations for that. Good job.
Yeah. All right.
So I think it's a good time to actually wrap up slowly but surely. What did we learn today?
So we learned how to integrate the Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos SDK library from NuGet. So really how to fetch it from there and then how to start using it. And then we also learned how to connect to an Azure Cosmos DB SQL API account using the SDK and .NET.
Indeed. And that was fun. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But obviously, people, if they want to get their hands dirty themselves, even if they don't have an Azure subscription yet, they can just open up Microsoft Learn, make sure that they log in with an Azure, with a Microsoft account, which obviously they can set up for free in case they don't have one yet, and go for the module themselves and gather some extra experience points and just stack them up. And obviously, there's more to learn from. Yeah, I'm really, really excited. I'm really, really excited. I think this was great. And in fact, even though we have talked about today on the usage of Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, there is more coming, right, Heini?
Yeah, there definitely is. There is, again, this study hall will be going on this entire spring, every single week. So there will be a new session happening next week as well.
And which is actually going to build on top of what we have learned just now, which is the utilization, the integration, and the connection of your product, your own application to Cosmos DB. Next week, we'll talk about configuring the Azure Cosmos DB SQL API SDK, and we're going to have a lot of fun with that SDK. So we're going to actually tune it up a bit from the complexity part, from the complexity perspective. Heini, did you already get certified?
Yeah, I actually did the beta exam, so I haven't heard back yet. What happened? I am excited to hear about it, but it was a really fun.
Building up. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Did you have a chance to do it as well?
No, I did not. I was lazy. I'll be honest. I was lazy before Christmas. I felt like, yeah, I'm definitely going to do it between Christmas and New Year's. It never happened, but I will definitely do it probably in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah. That's
especially
awesome,
because we're learning so much here. So I do feel confident at this point, honestly. And after all of these series, and with all the series coming up as well in our study hall, I do feel quite confident on that certification. So I'm probably going to take it.
Yeah, I think these are like really good preparation for it. And now I'm like, well, now I would be better prepared than I was.
100%. Yeah, totally.
And I have to say, I found it really fun, this certification, because it is so specific to Cosmos DB. And then that means it gets to go quite deep and to quite extensive topics. So really fun, and I can recommend doing it.
Yeah, I couldn't recommend it myself any more than that.
Yeah.
Good. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. Sahan definitely did a fantastic job actually answering all of them. And thank you for that.
Yeah.
And with that, I think it's a good time to, say goodbye to everyone and just tell them to keep on grinding and keep on the good work and learn more on Microsoft Learn.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and make sure to tune in next week as well.
It was great seeing and talking with you, Heini. Till next time.
You too, Alex. Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye.